Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would mean the world to us. And if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And of course, if you enjoy these deep dives into the unexplained, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. A massive thank you to Dogface680 and Michael Elliott for suggesting today's story. Your support and ideas fuel this channel. Now, let's begin. Imagine looking up at the night sky, believing humanity stands alone in the cosmic void. Now imagine discovering we've never been alone at all, that something has been watching us, circling silently above our heads, not for years or decades, but possibly for millennia. Long before we launched our first rocket, before we dreamed of touching the stars, something was already there, waiting, watching, recording. This is the story of the Black Knight satellite, and if even a fraction of what we're about to explore is true, everything we think we know about our place in the universe is wrong. The signals that shouldn't exist. Colorado Springs, 1899, the turn of a new century. The world stood on the brink of transformation. Electric lights were still a wonder in most cities. The automobile remained a curiosity for the wealthy. And radio, that invisible miracle that would soon connect the planet, existed only in the minds and laboratories of a handful of brilliant men. One of those men was Nikola Tesla. Tesla had always been different. Where others saw limits, he saw possibility. Where conventional science drew boundaries, he erased them. By 1899, he had already revolutionized the world with alternating current, transforming how electricity flowed through civilization itself. But Tesla wasn't satisfied with earthly achievement. His mind reached further, toward questions that made other scientists uncomfortable. In his Colorado laboratory, a converted electrical station on the outskirts of town, surrounded by coils that could generate artificial lightning and equipment that looked more like instruments of alchemy than science, Tesla conducted experiments that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. He was attempting something no one had successfully done before, transmitting electrical energy wirelessly across vast distances. The laboratory itself was a wonder. Locals watched with mixture of fear and fascination as Tesla's experiments lit up the night sky. Artificial lightning bolts crackled from his equipment, visible for miles. Thunder echoed across the plains. Some nights light bulbs miles away would glow faintly, powered by energy transmitted through the Earth itself, demonstrating Tesla's theories about wireless power transmission. The equipment was massive, strange, beautiful in its complexity. Copper coils rose 20 meters toward the ceiling, wrapped with miles of wire. Capacitors the size of barrels hummed with stored charge. A wooden tower extended above the building, supporting a copper sphere 3 feet in diameter, and at the center of it all, Tesla's receivers, sensitive enough to detect the faintest whispers of electromagnetic radiation from anywhere on Earth or beyond. Tesla worked alone most nights, preferring the quiet darkness when atmospheric interference was minimal. He would adjust his equipment with meticulous precision, tuning receivers to different frequencies, searching for patterns in the electromagnetic chaos that filled the air. He was mapping invisible territory, charting the contours of a realm no human had properly explored. It was during one of these late-night sessions in the depth of a Colorado winter that Tesla noticed something impossible, a signal, repeating, rhythmic, intelligent. At first, he thought his equipment was malfunctioning. He checked the connections, recalibrated the instruments, verified every element of his apparatus. He disconnected components one by one, testing each individually, searching for the source of interference. But the signal persisted, unchanged, undeterred by his modifications. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. A pattern too deliberate to be natural interference, too structured to be random atmospheric noise. Tesla's mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another experimenter? No. No one else had equipment sensitive enough or powerful enough to generate such signals. Could it be a natural phenomenon? Lightning created bursts of radio energy, but they were chaotic, unpredictable. This was neither. This was organised, intentional, communicative. He documented what he heard with meticulous precision, filling pages of his journal with notes, sketches, measurements. The signals came at regular intervals, precise as clockwork. They weren't like anything terrestrial radio could produce, because terrestrial radio barely existed yet. Marconi was still years away from his first transatlantic transmission. No radio towers dotted the landscape. No broadcasters filled the airwaves with music and news. Night after night, Tesla returned to his receivers, monitoring the signals. Sometimes they were strong, crisp, unmistakable. Other nights they faded, became whispers barely distinguishable from background noise. But they always followed the same pattern. 1, 2, 3. A counting sequence. Or perhaps something more complex that he couldn't yet decipher. He tried transmitting responses, sending rhythmic patterns back into the void, wondering if whatever sent the signals might recognize an attempt at communication. He varied frequencies, modified waveforms, attempted everything his understanding of electromagnetic theory suggested might establish two-way contact. But if his transmissions were received, he detected no acknowledgement, no change in the pattern. Yet these signals existed, clear, unmistakable, unexplainable. Tesla, never one to shy from bold speculation, reached a conclusion that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his notes, he suggested the signals might be coming from Mars, from some intelligent civilization attempting to make contact with Earth. He spoke about it publicly, though carefully, knowing how easily genius could be mistaken for madness. The scientific community largely dismissed him. Mars signals? Impossible. Absurd. The ramblings of a man too brilliant for his own good, they said. But Tesla knew what he had detected. He knew those signals were real, originating from somewhere beyond Earth's atmosphere, from a source humanity had not created and did not understand. What Tesla couldn't have known was that his discovery was just the beginning, that decades later, others would detect the same impossible signals, and that eventually those signals would be connected to something physical, something real, something orbiting silently in the darkness above, something that would come to be known as the Black Night. The long-delayed echoes. Time moved forward. Tesla's strange signals faded into footnote status, remembered mostly as an eccentric moment in the great inventor's career. The world plunged into war, then emerged into the roaring 20s, an age of jazz, prosperity, and unprecedented technological advancement. Radio had finally arrived. What Tesla had pioneered now connected the world. Voices and music travelled invisibly across continents. Engineers built better transmitters, more sensitive receivers, mapped the invisible highways of electromagnetic radiation that surrounded the planet, and in doing so, they found something else that shouldn't exist. Norway, 1927. A crisp autumn evening in Oslo. Engineer Jürgen Hals sat in his laboratory, surrounded by the latest radio equipment European technology could provide. He was part of a new generation of engineers who had grown up with radio, who understood its principles not as mysterious magic but as practical science. He worked for Telefunken, conducting experiments to better understand how radio waves propagated through Earth's atmosphere, research that would improve long-distance communication. The process was methodical, almost routine by this point. Send a pulse of radio energy into the sky, wait for it to bounce off the ionosphere, that newly discovered layer of charged particles high above Earth, measure the time delay, calculate the height of the ionosphere from that delay, build a better understanding of atmospheric physics. Hal sent his signal as usual, but the echo didn't return immediately. He waited, watching his equipment. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Still nothing. He checked his receiver, wondering if it had failed, if a vacuum tube had burned out, if a connection had loosened. Then the echo came, back. but it arrived 3 seconds late. 3 seconds. Hal stared at his instruments, certain something had malfunctioned. He ran the experiment again. Same result. Again, same delay. He verified his equipment component by component. Everything functioned perfectly. For radio waves travelling at the speed of light, 3 seconds meant the signal had travelled nearly 900,000 kilometres before returning. The ionosphere sat only 300 kilometres above Earth's surface, perhaps 400 at its highest. Simple mathematics showed the impossibility. There was nothing else for the signal to bounce off. Nothing that could cause such a delay. Nothing known to exist in that empty space between Earth and the Moon. Unless something else was up there. Something far beyond the ionosphere. Something large enough and solid enough to reflect radio waves back to Earth. Hals documented the anomaly meticulously. As a scientist, he knew the importance of reproducible results. He conducted the experiment dozens of times over the following weeks. Sometimes the delay was 3 seconds, sometimes 5, sometimes 8. Once, impossibly, the echo returned after 15 seconds, suggesting a distance of more than 4 million kilometres further than the Moon. The pattern was inconsistent, but it was undeniably real. Something was reflecting his signals from distances that made no sense. Hals documented the anomaly meticulously. He wasn't given to wild speculation, but he knew what he had measured. He published his findings, expecting scientific discourse, debate, investigation. Instead, he encountered silence. A few researchers acknowledged the data. Most simply ignored it, filing it away as some unexplained quirk of atmospheric physics that would eventually be understood through conventional means. But the long-delayed echoes, as they came to be called, didn't stop. Throughout the late 1920s and into the 30s, other researchers detected similar phenomena. Radio signals that returned seconds, sometimes even minutes after they should have. Echoes from nowhere or from somewhere impossibly distant. Some scientists proposed theories. Perhaps radio waves were bouncing off clouds of ionized gas far beyond Earth. Perhaps there were unknown layers of the atmosphere reflecting signals in unexpected ways. Perhaps it was all measurement error. But a few researchers, those willing to think beyond conventional boundaries, began to wonder about something else. What if the signals were bouncing off an object? Something in orbit far above the planet, placed there long before humanity had the capability to reach space. The idea seemed absurd. Satellites didn't exist. Spaceflight was pure fantasy, the domain of science fiction writers, not serious scientists. Yet the data persisted. The echoes continued, and deep in classified files and obscure scientific journals, a puzzle was forming that wouldn't be fully recognised for decades. Tesla's signals, Halsey's echoes, pieces of something larger, something watching, something waiting. The Black Knight was making itself known, even if no one yet understood what they were seeing. The Space Age Shock, October 4th, 1957. A date that changed human history forever. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into orbit, a polished sphere barely larger than a beach ball, equipped with simple radio transmitters that sent rhythmic beeps back to Earth. Those beeps announced to the world that humanity had finally escaped the cradle. We were no longer bound to our planet. The space age had begun. The United States reacted with shock, fear and determination. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a weapon there too. The space race ignited overnight. A competition not just for scientific achievement, but for survival itself. Both superpowers began launching satellites with increasing frequency. Communications satellites, weather satellites, spy satellites that neither side officially acknowledged but everyone knew existed. The sky above Earth, once pristine and empty, became crowded with human technology. And that's when the tracking systems noticed something wrong. Early 1960. Winter settled over the Northern Hemisphere, and in radar facilities across the United States, operators were doing what they did every day. Tracking objects in orbit, making sure American satellites were functioning, monitoring Soviet launches, keeping careful count of everything circling above. The facilities themselves were classified, buried in mountains or hidden on military bases. Massive radar dishes swept the sky continuously, painting electronic pictures of everything in orbit. Every satellite had a designation, a tracking number, a file documenting its launch, orbit, and purpose. The operators knew their territory the way night watchmen know every corner of their building. Then the radars detected something unexpected, an object, large enough to generate a solid radar return, in polar orbit. The first operator who noticed it thought he had made an error. He recalibrated his equipment, checked the tracking data against known satellite positions. Nothing matched. He called over his supervisor. Together they verified the contact. The object was real, definitely in orbit, definitely circling in a polar path that crossed both the north and south poles. Polar orbit meant the satellite passed over every part of Earth eventually, an ideal trajectory for reconnaissance or surveillance. This was significant, critically significant, because in 1960, no nation possessed the proven capability to place satellites in true polar orbit consistently. The Soviets were launching into equatorial orbits, easier to achieve from their launch sites at Baikonur. The Americans were doing the same from Cape Canaveral, yet here was an object definitely in orbit, definitely circling in a polar path, and definitely not supposed to exist according to any intelligence reports, any known launch schedules, any reasonable assessment of Soviet or American capabilities. The discovery travelled up the chain of command rapidly. Within hours, analysts at the North American Aerospace Defense Command were examining the data. Within days, the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership were briefed. This wasn't just unusual, this was potentially catastrophic. An unknown satellite in orbital space during the height of the Cold War meant someone had capabilities intelligence services hadn't detected. The tracking data was verified, then verified again. Multiple radar stations confirmed the object independently. Optical telescopes attempted to photograph it during night passes. The object was real, solid, reflecting radar clearly and occasionally visible as it crossed the night sky, a moving point of light following its impossible orbit. It wasn't a ghost image or atmospheric phenomenon. It wasn't radar glitch or operator error. Something physical was up there, and its mere existence represented a profound intelligence failure if it was Soviet, or a mind-bending mystery if it wasn't. Military officials contacted their Soviet counterparts through back channels, carefully worded inquiries. Is this yours? The answer came back negative. The Soviets denied ownership. They claimed to have no satellite in polar orbit, which meant either the Soviets were lying, which was possible, or something else was orbiting Earth. Something neither superpower had launched. The story leaked to the press. Newspapers ran headlines about a mystery satellite, a dark object circling Earth in an orbit no one could explain. The public read the stories with fascination and concern. Was it alien? Was it a secret weapon? What was watching us from above? Officials scrambled to control the narrative. The United States eventually claimed it might be debris from a failed launch. The Soviets suggested it could be a misidentified asteroid temporarily captured by Earth's gravity. Explanations piled upon explanations, each less convincing than the last. But inside government facilities, where tracking data accumulated in classified folders, analysts were asking harder questions. The object's orbit was too stable for debris, its trajectory too deliberate, and when they looked back through historical records, some researchers began connecting disturbing dots. Tesla's signals from 1899, the long-delayed echoes from the 1920s, and now this, an object in orbit that shouldn't exist, following a path that suggested surveillance, observation, monitoring. Someone, somewhere, gave it a name. Not officially. Not in any government document that would be declassified. But in whispered conversations between radar operators and late-night discussions among astronomers, the object acquired an identity. The Black Knight. A name pulled from medieval legend. A mysterious figure operating outside the rules, unknown and unknowable. It fit perfectly. because whatever was up there, it didn't follow the rules of human spaceflight. It predated our capabilities, and it showed no signs of leaving. The object that wouldn't leave through the early 1960s, the Black Knight became an obsession for those who knew about it. Lieutenant Commander James Breckenridge was one of those people. He worked at a classified tracking facility in the mountains of Colorado, spending 12-hour shifts in a windowless room, illuminated only by the green glow of radar screens. His job was simple on paper: track every object in orbit, maintain updated logs, report anomalies. In practice, it meant staring at blips of light representing humanity's tentative presence in space, watching satellites crawl across projected orbits, noting the gradual decay as atmospheric drag pulled them inevitably earthward. But one object refused to follow the rules. Breckenridge first noticed it during a routine overnight shift in February of 1961. The blip appeared on his screen, moving in its now familiar polar orbit. He logged it as usual, designation unknown-7. But something was different that night. The object seemed to change altitude, rising higher, then dropping lower, as if manoeuvring. Satellites didn't manoeuvre in 1961. They were inert objects following ballistic trajectories, obeying Newton's laws without question. Control systems for orbital manoeuvring wouldn't be perfected for years. Yet unknown-7 was accelerating, decelerating, adjusting its path in ways that suggested active propulsion. Breckenridge called his supervisor. Together they watched as the object performed what appeared to be a course correction, shifting its orbital plane by several degrees. The manoeuvre would have required thrust, fuel, sophisticated guidance systems, technology that, according to every intelligence assessment, didn't exist yet. The supervisor picked up a red phone, connected directly to NORAD headquarters. Within an hour, analysts were reviewing the tracking data, searching for explanations. Equipment malfunction, atmospheric aberration, radar glitch, none fit. The manoeuvre had been recorded by multiple stations independently. Unknown-7 had moved under its own power. This wasn't debris. This wasn't a passive satellite tumbling through space. This was something active, controlled, responsive. Tracking stations across the globe began monitoring it with renewed intensity. Astronomers pointed telescopes upward whenever it crossed the night sky, trying to photograph it, discern its shape, understand its nature. Intelligence agencies filed reports, classified and compartmentalized, accessible only to those with the highest clearances and need to know. The object's behavior became increasingly strange, increasingly inconsistent with any known satellite, human or otherwise. Sometimes it appeared on radar as a solid return signal, indicating something large and metallic, perhaps 10 to 15 meters in length. Other times it seemed to vanish completely, dropping off tracking systems as if it had the ability to mask itself from detection or slip into an orbit too distant for ground-based sensors to follow. Then, hours or days later, it would reappear, continuing its eternal circuit as if it had never left. Observers noted its appearances seemed to correlate with certain events. When the United States launched new satellites, Unknown-7 would appear, tracking parallel to the launches as if observing. When nuclear tests occurred in the Pacific, radar operators reported increased activity from the object, multiple passes over test sites in short succession. Its orbital path was another profound mystery. The polar orbit never decayed. Every satellite humans launched gradually lost altitude, pulled inexorably downward by atmospheric drag and gravitational perturbations. Even at high altitudes, thin wisps of atmosphere created friction, stealing energy, lowering orbits kilometre by kilometre. Eventually, every satellite would tumble back to Earth, burning up in the atmosphere or crashing into the ocean. But the Black Knight maintained its orbit. Year after year, decade after decade, it remained aloft at precisely the same altitude, as if immune to the forces that governed every other object in space, as if it possessed the ability to adjust its trajectory continuously, compensating for drag, maintaining perfect equilibrium. By the mid-60s, some analysts began keeping personal files, unofficial documentation of the object's behaviour. They noted patterns. The object seemed most active during periods of high solar activity. It appeared more frequently over certain latitudes, particularly over densely populated regions and areas of rapid technological development. It occasionally emitted radio signals, though never in response to attempted communications. One analyst, whose name remains classified to this day, wrote in a memo that was buried in secure archives. Unknown-7 exhibits behaviour inconsistent with any passive orbital object. It manoeuvres, it adjusts, it observes. Whatever this object is, it is fulfilling a purpose we do not understand, following directives we did not program, serving masters we have not met. Radio operators occasionally reported strange signals emanating from the object's vicinity, not constantly, not predictably. But sometimes, late at night when atmospheric conditions were optimal and background interference minimal, receivers would pick up brief transmissions, rhythmic patterns that echoed Tesla's original discovery more than 60 years earlier. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Specialist Thomas Chen worked the night shift at a signals intelligence facility in West Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the terrain shielded sensitive receivers from commercial radio. Interference. His job was to monitor Soviet communications, searching for patterns, intercepting transmissions, contributing to the vast intelligence apparatus that defined the Cold War. But one night in March of 1963, he picked up something that didn't fit any known Soviet frequency or communication protocol. The signal came through clearly, cutting through background static with unusual strength. Not voice, not data, just a rhythmic pulse. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, each pulse identical in duration and intensity. Chen adjusted his receiver, trying to pinpoint the source. The signal was coming from above, from orbital altitude. He checked the logs. No American satellites were scheduled to pass overhead. No Soviet satellites either, according to tracking data. He recorded the transmission, documented the time, frequency, and signal strength. As he listened, something about the pattern seemed intentional, communicative, as if whoever or whatever sent it was trying to convey meaning through sheer repetition. The signal lasted exactly 3 minutes. Then it stopped, cutting off mid-sequence as abruptly as it had begun. Chen filed his report. Days later, a classified courier arrived at his facility, collecting all documentation related to the transmission. He never learned what happened to his recordings. He was told only that the matter was being handled at higher levels, and that he should not discuss the incident with anyone, including other operators at his facility. But Chen wasn't the only one. Throughout the 60s and 70s, similar reports accumulated. Radio operators across the globe working independently, detecting the same rhythmic transmissions, always brief, always following the same pattern, always originating from orbital altitude when the black night was overhead. No one could decode the signals. Cryptanalysts attempted every technique known to intelligence agencies: pattern analysis, frequency decomposition, mathematical modelling. Nothing revealed meaning. The signals remained opaque, resistant to interpretation, as if they were either random noise that coincidentally formed patterns or sophisticated communications using principles human science hadn't yet discovered. One analyst proposed a disturbing theory. The signals weren't meant for us. They were status reports, transmitted back to whoever created the Black Knight, updating distant controllers about conditions on Earth. We weren't the intended recipients. We were merely the subjects being reported upon. Astronomers who managed to photograph the Black Knight described it as dark, angular, unlike the cylindrical or spherical shapes of human satellites. Some claimed it rotated slowly, presenting different faces to Earth as it passed overhead. Others said it seemed to orient itself deliberately, as if observing specific locations below. The theories multiplied. Some researchers believed it was a Soviet satellite, more advanced than publicly acknowledged, part of a secret military program. but the Soviet Union would have had no reason to hide such an achievement. If anything, they would have trumpeted it as proof of their technological superiority. Others thought it might be American, a classified spy satellite that officials denied to maintain secrecy. But that theory had holes too. Why polar orbit? Why such unusual behaviour? Why let it become a public mystery if you wanted to keep it secret? And then there were those who believed something else entirely. Those who looked at the evidence, all the accumulated decades of strange signals and impossible observations, and reached a conclusion that conventional science couldn't accept. The Black Knight wasn't launched by any human nation. It was already here, waiting in orbit long before we arrived. An ancient probe from somewhere else, placed in position to watch Earth, to monitor its inhabitants, to gather data for purposes we couldn't fathom. An alien satellite, older than human civilization, still functional, still watching. The idea seemed insane, yet the evidence refused to cooperate with conventional explanations, and as the years passed, as more data accumulated, the mystery only deepened. NASA and the missing context. December 1998. Nearly 4 decades after the Black Knight's first documented appearance in official tracking data. The Space Shuttle Endeavour lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on mission STS-88, carrying 6 astronauts and the first American component of what would become the International Space Station. The objective was historic: deliver the Unity module to orbit and attach it to the Russian-built Zarya control module. Humanity was building in space, creating something that would endure, a permanent outpost among the stars. The mission went smoothly by the exacting standards of spaceflight. Launch was nominal. Rendezvous with Zarya proceeded without incident. Astronauts successfully attached Unity, connecting American and Russian hardware in a symbolic embrace that transcended the old Cold War divisions. But during the mission, between more important tasks, something else happened. Something that would reignite decades-old mysteries and send conspiracy communities into overdrive. An astronaut, looking out one of Endeavour's windows during a quiet moment, noticed an object floating nearby. Not attached to the shuttle, not part of the International Space Station. Just there, tumbling slowly in the black void, catching sunlight as it rotated. The astronaut grabbed a camera. Training took over. Unknown objects near the spacecraft were potential hazards, collision risks that needed to be documented and tracked. Multiple photographs were taken from different angles as the object drifted past, its slow tumble presenting different faces to the camera. The images were striking. The object appeared dark, metallic, angular. It had distinct edges, structural features that didn't match the random shapes of typical space debris. It looked almost manufactured, purposeful, like something designed rather than something that had broken apart accidentally. When Endeavour returned to Earth and NASA released the mission photography, those images were buried in thousands of others. Routine documentation, astronaut shots of Earth, of the shuttle's payload bay, of crew members at work, nothing special, until someone noticed. A researcher combing through the images stopped at the photographs of the dark object. Something about it seemed familiar. The angular shape, the way it reflected light, the sense of something solid and deliberate rather than fragmented and chaotic. The researcher posted the images online with a simple question. Could this be the Black Knight? The internet response was instantaneous and explosive. Forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena erupted with analysis. Enhancement software was applied to the images, revealing more detail. Comparisons were made to old radar tracking data from the 1960s. Similarities were noted, catalogued, debated endlessly. Here it was, people said. Proof. The Black Knight, captured in high-resolution photography by NASA's own astronauts during a historic mission. The object looked exactly as the old reports described. Dark metallic material, unusual shape, nothing like conventional satellites or the tumbling wreckage of space debris. The photographs showed hard edges, structural integrity. a solidity that seemed inconsistent with broken fragments or discarded components. Mainstream media picked up the story. Television documentaries were produced with ominous music and dramatic narration. Books were written. The Black Knight satellite moved from classified whispers and obscure conspiracy theories to public consciousness, debated in living rooms and classrooms around the world. NASA responded quickly. Too quickly, some thought. The official explanation was simple. The object in the photographs was a thermal blanket, lost during a spacewalk when astronauts were working outside the shuttle. It had drifted away, been photographed, then eventually fell back to Earth and burned up in the atmosphere. Case closed. Mystery solved. Nothing to see here. Except the explanation didn't quite fit. The object in the photographs didn't look like a thermal blanket. It had hard edges, structural integrity, a solidity that seemed inconsistent with flexible insulation material. And its rotation, the way it tumbled through space, suggested mass and density beyond what a loose blanket should possess. More troubling, the photographs seemed to match descriptions from the 1960s. Same dark coloration, same angular appearance, same sense of something deliberate rather than accidental. Skeptics accepted NASA's explanation. A thermal blanket, simple as that. But those who had studied the Black Knight for years saw something else. They saw continuity, a thread connecting Tesla's signals to Halsey's echoes, to the 1960 radar contacts to these 1998 photographs. And they wondered, if this was just a lost thermal blanket, why did it look so much like what people had been reporting for decades? Why did it appear at the exact moment humanity was building a permanent presence in orbit? The timing felt significant, as if the Black Knight was making itself known again, reminding us it was there, watching as we expanded into its domain. NASA maintained its position. The matter was closed, but the photographs remained, circulating online, studied and analysed, kept alive by those who believed something far stranger than space debris was orbiting above. The ancient satellite theory. Let's step back and consider the impossible. What if the Black Knight is exactly what it appears to be? Not a misidentified satellite, not space debris, not a thermal blanket caught on camera, but something ancient, alien, deliberately placed in orbit around Earth thousands of years ago. The theory goes like this. At some point in the distant past, before recorded human history, perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, when humans still lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers, an extraterrestrial civilization detected Earth. Perhaps they observed our sun from afar, one of billions of stars catalogued by their astronomical instruments. They noticed the third planet fell within the habitable zone, possessed liquid water on its surface, showed chemical signatures of life in its atmosphere, oxygen and methane that shouldn't coexist without biological processes constantly replenishing them. This was promising. Life-bearing worlds were rare, and intelligent life potentially rarer still. The civilization decided to investigate, but the distances were vast, measured in light years. A crewed mission would be impossibly expensive, require resources they couldn't spare, commit generations to a journey that might reveal nothing more than bacteria and simple organisms. So they sent a probe instead, an automated sentinel designed to observe, record, analyse and perhaps transmit data back across the vast distances of interstellar space. The probe would be their eyes and ears, their scientific instrument operating independently for as long as necessary to document whatever intelligence might eventually arise on this promising world. The engineering required was extraordinary. The probe needed to survive for millennia, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years. Every component had to be designed for extreme longevity. No moving parts that could wear out, no chemical batteries that would deplete. Perhaps nuclear power, harvesting energy from radioactive decay that would continue for millions of years. Or solar panels constructed from materials that wouldn't degrade under constant bombardment from cosmic rays and solar radiation. The probe's intelligence was sophisticated but not conscious. It followed programming, decision trees that anticipated countless scenarios. If life exists but isn't intelligent, observe and record. If intelligence emerges, increase monitoring. If the intelligent species develops technology, begin attempting communication. If the species shows signs of self-destruction, document the process for future analysis. They launched it toward Earth, a journey that might have taken centuries or longer depending on their propulsion technology. The probe entered our solar system, decelerated, manoeuvred into orbit around Earth, specifically because this was where life had emerged, and then it began its mission. This probe entered orbit around Earth, deliberately choosing polar orbit specifically because that trajectory allows complete planetary coverage. Every location on Earth passes beneath a polar orbiting satellite eventually. Mountains, oceans, continents, poles, every climate zone and ecosystem would eventually fall under the probe's sensors. Perfect for long-term comprehensive observation. The probe was built to last, constructed from materials Earth science might not even have names for yet. Advanced alloys resistant to oxidation and radiation damage. Power systems that could operate for geological time periods. Shielding against micrometeorite impacts that would slowly sandblast conventional satellites to dust. Communication systems that could transmit findings back across interstellar distances, or storage systems that could preserve data until the probe's creators returned to collect it. Everything necessary for an indefinite mission in the hostile environment of space. And then it watched, silently, patiently, endlessly. It observed early humans emerging from Africa in waves of migration, spreading across continents, developing language, tools, social structures. It witnessed the agricultural revolution, the first permanent settlements, the birth of civilization itself. It saw empires rise from nothing. Sumer with its cuneiform writing, Egypt with its pyramids that would puzzle later generations, Greece with its philosophy, Rome with its roads and aqueducts that still function millennia later. All of this recorded, documented, transmitted back to whoever sent the probe, or stored in memory banks waiting for eventual retrieval. The probe remained invisible to humanity for thousands of years. Why would anyone look up and imagine something orbiting above? The concept of satellites didn't exist. Space was the realm of gods and stars, not machinery. But then, in the late 19th century, humans began playing with electricity and electromagnetic radiation. Tesla built his equipment, sensitive enough to detect faint signals from space. And for the first time, the probe's transmissions were heard. Not understood, but heard. The probe might have adjusted its behaviour. Perhaps it increased observation intensity, recognizing that humanity was approaching technological maturity. The long-delayed echoes could have been deliberate pings, the probe testing whether humans were developing the capability to detect orbital objects. When the space age began, when humans finally launched their own satellites, the probe became detectable in new ways. Radar systems designed to track Sputnik also detected this older, stranger object. And suddenly, what had orbited unseen for millennia was noticed, questioned, feared. The 1998 photographs might represent the probe allowing itself to be seen. A deliberate revelation, perhaps, or simply the result of humanity's improved observational capabilities finally catching up to something that had been there all along. This theory explains everything. Tesla's signals, the first human detection of transmissions from something beyond Earth, the long-delayed echoes, the probe testing whether humans were developing the capability to detect orbital objects, the impossible polar orbit discovered in 1960 suddenly visible to tracking systems designed for the space age, the recurring sightings, the unexplained maneuvers, the signals that emerge and fade like whispers from something trying to remain hidden. Of course, it's also the most extraordinary claim imaginable, an alien probe orbiting Earth for thousands of years. The evidence required for such a claim would need to be overwhelming, undeniable, far beyond what currently exists in declassified files and public knowledge. But here's what keeps people awake at night, staring at their ceilings, wondering, what conventional explanation accounts for all the data? All the sightings spanning more than a century? All the strange signals that follow the same pattern across decades? all the tracking data showing an object that behaves unlike anything humans have launched. The mystery demands an answer. And until conventional science provides one that fits every piece of evidence, every anomaly, every unexplained observation, the ancient satellite theory remains uncomfortably, disturbingly plausible. Imagine it for a moment. Really imagine it. Something artificial, something built by intelligence circling above your head right now, not launched yesterday or last year or even in your lifetime, but placed there before pyramids rose from Egyptian sand, before humans had written language, before civilization itself, watching as you go about your day, recording as history unfolds below, transmitting data about humanity to receivers so distant that the signals have been travelling through space for thousands of years and still haven't arrived. And us, down here, only recently developing the technology to even detect that it's there, like children finally noticing the security camera that's been filming us since birth. That's the theory. That's what some people believe the evidence suggests, and whether it's true or not, the implications are staggering. Why polar orbit matters. Let's talk about orbital mechanics, because understanding the significance of the Black Knight's trajectory is crucial to understanding why this mystery won't die. When humans launch satellites, we generally choose orbits based on the satellite's purpose. Communication satellites go into geostationary orbit above the equator, matching Earth's rotation so they appear fixed in the sky. Weather satellites often use sun-synchronous orbits, passing over the same locations at the same local time each day. The polar orbit is different. A satellite in polar orbit crosses over both poles, circling Earth perpendicular to the equator. As Earth rotates beneath it, the satellite eventually passes over every point on the planet's surface. This makes polar orbit ideal for one thing: global surveillance. Intelligence satellites use polar orbits. Earth observation satellites monitoring climate, resources and environmental changes use polar orbits. If you want to see everything, monitor everything, record everything happening on a planet, polar orbit is exactly where you'd position your satellite. Now consider the difficulty of achieving polar orbit. It requires more energy than equatorial orbits. Launch sites near the equator provide a velocity boost from Earth's rotation, but only for eastward launches. Polar orbits require launching north or south, losing that rotational advantage. In 1960, when the Black Knight was first officially detected, only the most advanced space programs could theoretically achieve polar orbit. The United States wouldn't successfully launch a satellite into true polar orbit until later. The Soviets faced similar challenges, yet there it was, an object in perfect polar orbit, stable, persistent, unexplained. If the ancient satellite theory is correct, polar orbit makes perfect sense. An alien probe designed to monitor Earth would need comprehensive coverage. It would need to observe all civilizations, all geographical locations, all human activity. Polar orbit provides that. The probe could pass over every major population centre, every battlefield, every technological development. Nothing would escape its observation. And here's something else to consider. A polar orbit doesn't just allow observation, it also provides concealment. Objects in polar orbit aren't constantly visible from any single location. They pass overhead, disappear beyond the horizon, and don't return for hours. Unlike geostationary satellites that remain fixed in the sky, a polar orbiting object appears, then vanishes, making it much harder to study and track. For a probe trying to observe while minimizing detection, polar orbit is ideal. Maximum coverage, minimum visibility. The more you understand orbital mechanics, the more the Black Knight's trajectory seems deliberately chosen. Not random, not accidental, but optimized for long-term planetary surveillance. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If something has been watching us from optimal surveillance, orbit for potentially thousands of years, what has it seen? What has it recorded? And more importantly, what is it waiting for? Debunking versus doubt. Let's be honest, the Black Knight satellite theory has problems. Serious problems that any rational analysis must acknowledge. First, there's no physical evidence, no retrieved fragments, no confirmed photographs that definitively show an artificial structure inconsistent with known space debris. Everything we have is radar data, ambiguous images and historical reports that could have conventional explanations. Second, the 1998 NASA photographs, while intriguing, really might be a thermal blanket. The agency's explanation is plausible. Thermal blankets do look metallic. They do tumble in space, and the shuttle crew did lose one during that mission. Sometimes the simplest explanation is correct. Third, the early radar contacts from 1960 could have been misidentified Soviet satellites. The Cold War was characterized by secrecy and misinformation. The Soviets might have been testing advanced orbital mechanics they didn't want to reveal, or American radar operators might have misinterpreted their data. Fourth, Tesla's signals and the long-delayed echoes have alternate explanations. Natural radio sources exist in space. Pulsars, quasars, magnetized planets. What Tesla detected might have been Jupiter's powerful radio emissions, which weren't understood until decades later. The long-delayed echoes could result from complex ionospheric conditions or interactions with Earth's magnetosphere. These explanations exist. They're reasonable. They require no extraordinary assumptions about alien probes or ancient surveillance. Yet they don't entirely satisfy, because while each individual piece of evidence can be explained away, the pattern of evidence is harder to dismiss. Tesla's signals in 1899, Halsey's echoes in the 1920s, the 1960 radar contacts, the 1998 photographs, reports spanning more than a century, all describing something similar, all pointing towards something in orbit that shouldn't exist. Coincidence? Possibly. The human mind excels at finding patterns even in random data. We see faces in clouds, meaning in chaos. Perhaps the Black Knight is just our pattern recognition software creating connections where none exist. But there's another issue. Much of the data remains classified. The United States government hasn't released all radar tracking information from the 1960s. Intelligence agencies haven't opened their files on unidentified orbital objects. NASA maintains its thermal blanket explanation, but hasn't provided detailed analysis of the object's composition or trajectory. This lack of transparency fuels suspicion. If the explanations are so straightforward, why not release everything? Let independent researchers examine all the data, reach their own conclusions, settle the matter, definitively. The silence suggests either there's nothing to hide, and releasing classified data serves no purpose, or there's something to hide, and releasing classified data would raise questions officials don't want to answer. We're left in limbo, no proof of alien origin, but also no complete conventional explanation that accounts for all the evidence across all the decades. The Black Knight exists in that uncomfortable space where debunking and doubt coexist, where reasonable skepticism meets reasonable curiosity, where the simplest explanation might be correct, or might be missing something profound. If it's real, why now? Assume for a moment the impossible is true. An ancient alien probe has been orbiting Earth for thousands of years. This raises an obvious question. Why? Why would an extraterrestrial civilization place a probe here? What would they be looking for? And if they've been observing us for millennia, why haven't they made contact? One theory suggests the probe is waiting for humanity to reach a certain level of technological development. Perhaps the civilization that sent it operates under a non-interference principle, similar to ideas explored in science fiction. They observe but don't interfere, allowing intelligent species to develop naturally. The probe might have been programmed to simply watch and record until humans achieved spaceflight, nuclear technology, or some other milestone indicating maturity. Tesla's detection of signals might have been the first time humanity was technologically capable of noticing the probe. The probe might have responded by increasing transmission frequency, essentially saying, "Yes, we're here. You're finally advanced enough to detect us." Another theory centers on nuclear weapons. Humans first detonated atomic bombs in 1945. Within 15 years, radar systems detected the Black Knight. Coincidence? Or did nuclear weapons trigger increased probe activity? An alien civilization monitoring Earth might be particularly interested in whether emerging intelligent species develop weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear capability represents a threshold, the ability to destroy civilization or, eventually, spread destruction beyond a single planet. A monitoring probe might intensify observation once that threshold is crossed. Some researchers have noted that major UFO waves and sightings increased after World War II, coinciding with atomic weapon development. If the Black Knight is real, it might be connected to a broader program of observation, with the satellite component supplemented by closer-range reconnaissance. Climate change presents another possible trigger. If the probe is designed to monitor planetary health alongside intelligent life, recent environmental deterioration might warrant increased attention. Rising temperatures, mass extinctions, ocean acidification, all signs that an intelligent species is destabilizing its own biosphere. Then there's the simple data collection theory. The probe is a scientific instrument, nothing more. It records everything, transmits data back across interstellar distances, or stores it for eventual retrieval. No judgment, no interaction, just observation. Humanity is a long-term experiment, and the probe is patiently gathering data points across millennia. Or perhaps the probe isn't waiting for anything. Perhaps it's simply fulfilling its programming, orbiting and observing until its creators return. If those creators exist on a timescale different from human civilization, thousands of years might be a brief interval. They placed the probe in orbit, went about other business elsewhere in the galaxy, and plan to return for their data eventually. The most unsettling theory is that the probe already accomplished its mission. It observed Earth, recorded what it needed, transmitted findings home. Now it's just there, a forgotten piece of technology circling a planet its creators no longer care about. We're noticed, catalogued, and dismissed. All of these theories assume the probe exists, which remains unproven. But if it does exist, the question of why now becomes critical. Because whatever triggered the probe's increased detectability in the mid-20th century might be the same thing that eventually triggers direct contact or judgment. Still there, still watching, we return to the present day, December 20th, 2025. Thousands of satellites now orbit Earth, communications networks connecting every continent, GPS constellations guiding ships, aircraft, and your phone's navigation app. Scientific instruments studying climate, tracking storms, measuring ice melt. Space stations where astronauts live for months at a time. The sky above has become crowded with human technology, this shell of machinery encircling the planet so dense that collisions are now a genuine concern. And somewhere in that crowded sky, if the evidence is to be believed, something older remains. Objects still appear on tracking systems that defy easy classification. Space debris is catalogued meticulously now. Every piece larger than 10 centimetres tracked and monitored by the United States Space Surveillance Network. Over 34,000 objects. Defunct satellites, spent rocket stages, fragments from collisions and tests. Each one has a designation, an orbit, a history. But sometimes anomalies emerge. Objects that don't match known debris. Objects in unusual orbits that seem too stable for uncontrolled fragments. Objects that seem to maneuver, changing trajectory in ways that simple debris cannot. Obeying rules we haven't programmed. In October of 2023, operators at a tracking facility noticed something strange. An object in polar orbit, previously catalogued as debris from a Chinese satellite, performed what appeared to be a course correction. Minor, barely detectable, but present in the data. Debris doesn't course correct. Debris doesn't adjust its trajectory. The operators filed a report, requested additional observations, attempted to photograph the object during its next pass. The object vanished from tracking before the next observation window. When it reappeared 3 days later, it was in a slightly different orbit, as if it had deliberately moved to avoid scrutiny. The incident was classified. Analysis was restricted to those with specific clearances, and nothing official was ever released to the public. Are these the Black Night? Or are they new mysteries separate from the old? Different objects fulfilling similar purposes perhaps? A fleet rather than a single probe? Multiple watchers ensuring complete coverage? The truth is, we don't know. We track what we can with the technology available. We explain what we're able to explain using conventional physics and reasonable assumptions. And the rest lives in that grey zone of uncertainty, filed away in classified databases, occasionally discussed in closed meetings, never fully resolved. The Black Night has been officially dismissed, relegated to conspiracy theory status. NASA's thermal blanket explanation satisfied most people, allowed the mainstream to move on. The radar contacts from the 1960s are historical curiosities now, artifacts of Cold War paranoia and primitive tracking technology that sometimes saw ghosts in the noise. Tesla's signals and the long-delayed echoes are interesting footnotes in the history of radio science, but not evidence of anything extraordinary. Case closed. The file stamped explained and returned to the archives, except it's not closed. Not really. Because new generations keep discovering the story, keep examining the evidence, keep asking questions that don't have satisfying answers. Young researchers stumble across the old reports, read Tesla's journals, examine the tracking data from 1960, look at those 1998 photographs, and wonder, why doesn't this add up? And occasionally, very occasionally, something happens that reignites the mystery. A new photograph capturing something that shouldn't be there. An unexplained radar contact during a routine tracking sweep. A signal detected by radio telescopes, rhythmic and structured, coming from orbital altitude when no known satellite is positioned to transmit. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The pattern continues, stretching across more than a century now. The mystery persists, accumulating new layers while the old questions remain unanswered. If the Black Night is real, if an ancient probe truly orbits above us, it hasn't left. Despite our satellites crowding its domain, despite our space stations and our telescopes, and our increasing ability to observe and track, it remains, still there, maintaining its eternal watch, recording our progress or our decline, waiting for whatever conditions its programming requires, before revealing itself fully or transmitting its final report. And if it's not real? If the whole thing is misidentification, coincidence and pattern seeking? If it's just our minds creating connections in unrelated data, seeing purpose in random noise? Then we've created a modern myth, a technological ghost story that reflects something deep in the human psyche, our fears and hopes about the cosmos and our place within it, our desperate need to believe we're not alone, our equally desperate fear that we might be observed by intelligences we cannot comprehend. Either way, the story matters, the question matters, because it forces us to look up and wonder, to question whether we're alone, truly alone in this vast universe, to consider that the night sky might contain more than distant stars and lifeless void, to imagine that consciousness, intelligence, purpose might exist in forms we haven't yet recognized. The night sky seems empty when you look up, peaceful, constant. The same stars that guided ancient navigators still visible, still tracing their predictable paths. Nothing seems to have changed in the heavens. But perhaps that's exactly the point. Perhaps the best surveillance is the kind that never draws attention, the kind that watches while remaining invisible, records while appearing absent, fulfills its mission while the subjects never suspect they're being observed, and perhaps, on certain nights, when atmospheric conditions are right and electronic interference is minimal, if you listen very carefully with sensitive enough equipment, you might still hear it. That signal, that pattern, that message sent from something that shouldn't exist, echoing through the electromagnetic spectrum the way it has for more than a century. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. A countdown, a greeting, a warning, a simple acknowledgement that yes, we see you, we've always seen you, we're still here, we don't know, we may never know, but somewhere above, circling in the darkness between stars and earth, between what we know and what we fear, between the possible and the impossible, something continues its ancient mission. Still there, still watching, still keeping its secrets, and maybe, just maybe, still waiting for the moment when humanity is ready to receive the message it's been broadcasting all along. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. What if the child who came home wasn't entirely the same child who disappeared? There's a photograph that haunts the internet. You've probably seen it. A small boy, dirty and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket, staring into a camera with eyes that seem far too old for his face. The rescue photo from June 2022, taken moments after 3-year-old Riker Webb was found alive in the Montana wilderness after vanishing for 2 terrifying nights. The world celebrated a miracle. Parents everywhere felt relief wash over them. Search and rescue teams were praised as heroes. The story had a happy ending. But if you look closer at that photograph, if you read between the lines of the official reports, if you listen to the whispers from Lincoln County, Montana, you'll find something else entirely. Something that suggests the miracle wasn't as simple as a lucky find. Something that implies those 2 days in the woods changed more than just a frightened child's perspective. This is the story of what really happened to Riker Webb, or at least what might have happened. Because the truth, as you'll soon discover, has been carefully managed, quietly buried, and deliberately obscured. My name is Elena Ferguson, and I'm a journalist from Spokane, Washington. I spent a year investigating this case, and what I found will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing children, wilderness survival, and the things that live in places humans rarely venture. Intro: the photo that never made sense. June 5, 2022, Montana. When Riker Webb walked out of those woods, when search teams found him inside an abandoned shed nearly 2 miles from his home, the relief was universal. News outlets ran the story with headlines like "Miracle in Montana" and "Toddler beats the odds." His parents wept with joy. The community of Troy, a tiny outpost in Lincoln County with barely 1,000 residents, exhaled collectively. But I remember seeing that photograph for the first time and feeling something other than relief. Call it journalistic instinct or maybe just human intuition. But something was wrong with the picture. Not technically wrong. The image was clear enough. The rescue workers looked appropriately concerned. The blanket wrapped around the boy was standard issue emergency gear. It was his face that bothered me. His hair looked different. Matted, yes, from 2 nights in the rain, and cold. but there was something about the way it framed his features that seemed older somehow, as if he had aged more than 48 hours. His expression didn't match what you would expect from a 3-year-old who just endured a terrifying ordeal alone in bear country. There was no crying, no reaching for parents, no visible fear or relief. Just this calm, almost watchful stare. And his eyes. God, his eyes looked wrong. Not injured or diseased, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate then and still struggle to explain now. They looked like they'd seen something no child should see. Something no adult should see, for that matter. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Online forums began picking apart the photograph within hours. Reddit threads spawned conspiracy theories. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons cases flagged the image as unusual. Most of it was the typical internet noise, people seeing patterns where none existed, making mountains from molehills. But some of the observations were harder to dismiss. Someone pointed out that Riker's skin tone seemed different in the rescue photo compared to family pictures taken weeks earlier. Another noted that the way he held his hands seemed too controlled for a traumatized toddler. A retired pediatric nurse commented that his facial expressions suggested a developmental age inconsistent with 3 years old. The mainstream media ignored these observations as they should have. Conspiracy theories about missing children are dangerous territory, and most of the speculation was baseless. Most of it, but not all of it. Because as I dug deeper, as I travelled to Troy and started interviewing people who were actually there, who actually participated in the search, who actually saw Riker in those first hours after he was found, I realised the official story had holes. Big holes. The kind of holes that exist because the truth has been carefully excavated and replaced with something more palatable. This is that truth, or as close as I could get to it. Act 1. The real timeline. Let me start with what we know for certain. The documented facts that nobody disputes. June 3, 2022. Late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Riker Webb disappeared from his family's yard on Deerwood Lane in Troy, Montana. He'd been playing outside while his parents worked on household projects. The yard backed up to dense wilderness, the kind of thick forest that characterises northwestern Montana, all Douglas fir and western larch, with underbrush so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. His parents called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office immediately. By evening, a full-scale search operation was underway. Ground teams, ATVs, tracking dogs, air support with helicopters, everything you'd mobilise for a missing child in mountain country. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures that night dropped into the low 40s. Heavy rain moved through the area. This was wilderness where mountain lions prowled and black bears were common. The terrain was unforgiving, full of cliffs and ravines and abandoned mining cabins from Montana's resource extraction past. The search continued through June 4th and into June 5th. 72 hours of coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement from multiple agencies. Then, on the morning of June 5, almost exactly 48 hours after he vanished, Riker was found inside a shed on Pine Ridge Road, approximately 2 miles from his home. According to the official report, he was dirty, hungry, quiet, and alert. He showed signs of exposure but no serious injuries. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation, checked out as remarkably healthy given the circumstances, and returned to his grateful parents. Case closed. Miracle achieved. Happy ending secured. Except for the details that didn't make the news, the observations that were logged and then buried, the witness statements that were taken and then classified, the evidence that suggested Riker's survival wasn't miraculous. It was impossible. Let me walk you through what I found. Act 2. The First Lies. The shed owner was a man named Reginald Dixon, a retired logger in his 70s, who lived about a quarter mile from the structure where Riker was discovered. I interviewed him at his home, A modest cabin that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. Reginald was cooperative but clearly uncomfortable. He told me the shed had been locked the last time he checked it, over a week before Riker disappeared. He hadn't stored food there, no blankets, no supplies that might help a child survive. Just tools, he said, staring at his hands. Old equipment I don't use much anymore. The door had a padlock on it. I'm certain of that. But when the search team found Riker, I pressed, the door was open. Wide open, he confirmed. Lock was gone. Never found it. Could Riker have opened it himself? Reginald looked at me like I'd suggested the child could fly. He's 3 years old, miss. That lock required a key. Even if it didn't, even if it was somehow left unlocked, the door swelled from rain. I had to put my shoulder into it last time I opened it. A grown man's shoulder. So someone else opened it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. Something opened it. That's all I know for certain. The distinction felt important. I pushed further, asking about Riker's condition when he was found. Reginald hadn't been present for the discovery, but he'd spoken to the search team members who were. They said he looked cold, but not hypothermic, Reginald recalled. Which doesn't make sense, does it? 2 nights in the 40s with rain? A child that small should have been in serious trouble, but his core temperature was apparently fine, like something kept him warm. The shed itself. That shed has gaps in the walls you could stick your finger through. It's not insulated. It barely keeps the rain out. I thanked Reginald for his time and moved on to my next source, but his words echoed in my mind. Something opened it. Something kept him warm. Not someone. Something. My next breakthrough came through a Freedom of Information Act request I'd filed months earlier. The search and rescue logs finally arrived, heavily redacted but still revealing. Most of it was standard documentation. Team assignments, search grid coordinates, timing of various sweeps through the forest. But scattered throughout were observations that painted a very different picture than the official narrative. June 4, 11:23 a.m. Thermal anomaly detected on ridge approximately 1.3 miles northeast of last known position. Negative on visual confirmation. Signature disappeared before ground team arrival. June 4, 2:47 p.m. Multiple thermal signatures appear and disappear rapidly in Sector 7. Equipment malfunction suspected but unconfirmed. Signatures do not match known wildlife patterns. June 4, 7:15 p.m. Team 3 reports audible childlike vocalization from unreachable location. Cliff face prevents access. Vocalization ceased before climbing equipment deployed. And then the entry that made my hand shake when I read it. June 4, 9:03 p.m. Eyes in the tree line. Size inconsistent with known wildlife. Recommend daylight follow-up. Location marked. This entry was written by a volunteer firefighter named Marcus Tully. I tracked him down to a bar in Libby, about 30 miles south of Troy. He refused to talk to me at first, literally walked away when I introduced myself and mentioned Riker's case. It took 3 visits, and finally buying him dinner before he'd even acknowledge being on the search team. I don't talk about that night, he said, pushing food around his plate. I was told not to talk about that night. Told by who? He looked up at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. People who made it clear my cooperation was appreciated and my silence was expected. What did you see, Marcus? He was quiet for a long time, then so softly I almost missed it. Something watching us. Something big enough that the eyes were level with mine and I'm 6 feet tall. But it was crouched in the brush, I could tell by the angle. If it stood up. He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. Did you tell the search coordinators? I logged it. You've seen the log, so you know I logged it. They told me it was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears, miss. I've seen them up close. That wasn't a bear. What was it? I don't know, he said, meeting my eyes. And I don't want to know. I've got a family. I've got a life here. Some questions aren't worth asking. I had one more question for him, though. The helicopter footage, I said. The FLIR imaging from the air search. Have you seen it?" His expression darkened. "It doesn't exist. Officially. But unofficially? Unofficially, the pilot saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Unofficially, that footage was classified faster than you can blink. Officially, there was a malfunction, and no usable imagery was captured." I managed to track down the pilot, a man named Sam Keller, who worked for a private helicopter service contracted by the county. He was even more reluctant to talk than Marcus, but I caught him at the right moment after a few drinks at a hangar party when his guard was down. "I saw something moving behind that kid," he told me, words slightly slurred. In the thermal image, clear as day, something big crouched down like it was, I don't know, hiding, protecting him. The shape was wrong for a person, too tall, too thin. But it was there, right behind where we found him the next morning. What happened to the footage? 2 guys in suits showed up at my office 6 hours after the search ended. Didn't identify themselves, just said the footage was part of an ongoing investigation and they were confiscating the storage drives. I never saw them again, never got the drives back. When I asked the county about it, they told me there was no record of any confiscation. As far as they're concerned, the footage never existed. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, but I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't nothing. Act 3. Local legends. Local fear. The Kootenai tribe has lived in this region for thousands of years, long before Montana was Montana, long before white settlers arrived with their maps and mining claims. Their reservation isn't far from Troy, and I'd heard rumours that some of the tribal elders had knowledge about the forest that went beyond simple folklore. It took time to build trust, to find someone willing to talk to an outsider about sensitive subjects. But eventually, through a contact at the Tribal Cultural Centre, I was introduced to an elder named Joseph Running Bear. We met at his home, a modest house surrounded by pines, where he served me tea and studied me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable with. "You're asking about the Webb boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Running Bear. I'm trying to understand what happened to him." He nodded slowly. "The forest near Troy has been different. For as long as our people have memory, we have stories about that place. Old stories." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about the mimics, the lost ones, the things that live in the deep woods and sometimes take interest in humans, especially children." He poured more tea, taking his time, choosing his words carefully. "Our legends speak of beings that can imitate human voices, especially the voices of children. They call out in the dark, leading people astray. But sometimes, rarely, they do the opposite. Sometimes they protect. Protect who? The innocent, the vulnerable, children who wander into their territory. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm tea. "Why would they do that?" Joseph shrugged. "The stories don't explain their motivations. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they remember being human once if they ever were. Maybe they operate on logic we can't understand, but the pattern is consistent. Some who go missing in those woods return, and some who return are not quite the same." "Not the same how?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They come back changed. Sometimes physically, sometimes in behaviour, sometimes in ways harder to define. Like they've seen something, experienced something, that fundamentally altered them. The eyes are usually what people notice first. The eyes look older. My hands were shaking. I set down the teacup. "Has this happened before? With other children?" "I cannot speak to specific cases," he said carefully, "but I can tell you that the area around Bull Lake Road and Pine Ridge Road has a history. Our people avoided certain parts of that forest traditionally. We marked them as places where the boundary between worlds is thin." After leaving Joseph's home, I went to the Lincoln County Courthouse and started digging through old records, missing persons cases going back decades. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. 7 missing child cases since 1960, all within a 2-mile radius of Pine Ridge Road. 3 found alive, all with memory gaps, all describing similar experiences: darkness, cold, then warmth. a presence that felt protective rather than threatening, and finally being led or carried to a place where humans could find them. The other 4 were never found. The 3 survivors all exhibited behavioural changes after their return: withdrawal, night terrors, unusual maturity for their age. In each case, the official explanation was trauma from being lost in the wilderness. But reading between the lines, reviewing old police reports and newspaper articles, I could see the pattern Joseph had described. Something in that forest takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they come back different. I managed to track down a woman who taught at Riker's preschool, though she insisted on anonymity. We met at a coffee shop in Kalispell, far enough from Troy that she felt safe talking. He changed after he came back, she told me, stirring her coffee nervously. I mean, you'd expect some trauma response, right? A child going through something that frightening. But it was more than that. How so? He was more withdrawn, yes. The night terrors were bad, according to his parents, but there was also this maturity. Like he'd suddenly understood things he shouldn't understand at 3 years old. The way he'd look at you sometimes, it was like being evaluated by an adult in a child's body. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. He kept talking about the other boy. Said the other boy was nice, that the other boy kept him warm, that the other boy told him stories. Did his parents mention this? They told me he was just processing the trauma through imagination, creating an imaginary friend to cope with being alone, but what? One day, about a month after he came back, he was drawing in class. I looked over his shoulder and saw he'd drawn 2 figures. When I asked him who they were, he said, me and him. I asked who him was, and he looked at me like I was stupid. He said, the other boy. He said he'd stay in the woods so I could come home. He said it was a fair trade. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I mentioned it in a report to the school counsellor. 2 days later, I was called into the principal's office with a county official I'd never met. They told me that spreading rumours about the Webb case was harmful to the family and potentially actionable. They strongly suggested I focus on Riker's present well-being and stop dwelling on his statements about the experience. They threatened you. They didn't have to threaten explicitly. The message was clear. Stop talking about this, or there will be consequences. Act 4. The eyewitness who breaks the case. For months, I'd been trying to find someone from the original search team willing to go on record with details that contradicted the official story. Most refused outright. Others simply stopped returning my calls. The culture of silence around the Webb case was ironclad. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognise. The voice on the other end was elderly, male, hesitant. Miss Ferguson, my name is Benjamin Hartley. I understand you've been investigating what happened to the Webb boy. I think we should talk. We met at his home outside Troy, a small ranch house with a view of the Cabinet Mountains. Benjamin was in his late 60s, a retired contractor who'd volunteered with search and rescue teams for over 30 years. I was there, he said simply, once we'd settled in his living room. I was on the team that found him. My heart rate picked up. Can you tell me what you saw? He pulled out a folder, old and worn, and handed it to me. These are copies I made before I turned in my official report. I knew even then that something wasn't right about how the whole thing was being handled. Inside were photographs, notes, sketches, evidence that had never made it into the public record. We found footprints, Benjamin said, pointing to one of the photos, next to where Riker had been. Small footprints consistent with a child his size, but there were others. The photograph showed depressions in the mud near the shed. Alongside the small prints were larger ones, much larger, and they were barefoot. Human? I asked. Shaped like human feet, Benjamin corrected, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, and the stride length suggested something tall, very tall. How tall? Based on them spacing, I'd estimate 7 feet, maybe more. He showed me another photograph, this one showing drag marks in the dirt. These led to the shed, short marks like something was being carried. The spacing and depth suggested significant weight, more than a 3-year-old child. like whatever was carrying him was heavy enough to sink deeper into the ground. Could it have been an animal? A bear? Benjamin shook his head. I've tracked animals my whole life. These weren't animal prints. And there were these other impressions. He pointed to circular marks in another photograph. We couldn't figure out what made these. They were too regular to be natural, too random to be man-made. One of the guys on my team said they looked like a deer standing on its hind legs might make, but that's absurd. What did the sheriff's office say? They told us to exclude the unusual prints from our official report, said it would confuse the investigation and distract from the main goal of finding Riker safe. When I pointed out that Riker had already been found, they changed their reasoning, said it would traumatise the family to know something else had been near their son, said we should focus on the positive outcome and not create unnecessary fear. He leaned back, looking tired. But here's the thing that really bothered me. When we actually found Riker, when we approached the shed, the door was standing wide open, not just unlocked, open, like something had just left. Did you see anything? No, but I felt it. We all felt it. Something watching us from the tree line. Something that disappeared the moment we got close to the boy. Benjamin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. I recorded part of the search team briefing that morning. I wasn't supposed to, but I had a feeling things were about to get strange. I was right. He played the recording for me. The audio quality was poor, but I could make out voices discussing the search plan. Then clearly a deputy's voice. We are classifying the unidentified presence as environmental. Do not report visual details in your statements. Keep your descriptions limited to the child's condition and location. Another voice, one I didn't recognise. Higher authorities have already been contacted. They'll handle the anomalous elements. Your job is to stick to the facts. The simple facts. I looked at Benjamin. Higher authorities? No one ever identified who they were, but 2 unmarked vehicles showed up that afternoon. Federal plates. The men inside asked to review all our documentation. They were particularly interested in the photographs of the footprints and the thermal imaging data. What did they look like? Professional, clean-cut, the kind of people who are used to having authority and not explaining it. One of them, the one in the green jacket, interviewed several of us separately. He asked strange questions. Like what? He wanted to know if Riker had spoken to it. His exact word, it. Not who, not what, just it. He asked if the boy seemed older somehow, if he looked like himself. At the time, I thought the questions were bizarre. Now, he trailed off, looking out the window at the mountains. Now I think he knew exactly what we'd found, and he was checking to see if Riker had been changed by whatever was out there with him. Act 5. The conspiracy deepens. The more I investigated, the more layers I uncovered. What had started as a simple question about a missing child had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Through various sources, I'd learned that several agencies had been present during and immediately after Riker's rescue. The obvious ones were expected. Local search and rescue, Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies, Montana Fish, wildlife, and parks officers. But there were others. 2 unmarked federal vehicles had arrived the afternoon of June 5. No one could tell me which agency they represented. The men inside carried no visible identification, but had authority that local law enforcement immediately deferred to. One witness, a volunteer who'd been helping coordinate the search from a command post, told me the man in the green jacket had arrived with very specific questions that suggested prior knowledge. He knew there would be unusual elements before anyone told him, the witness said. He arrived asking about them, not whether they existed, but what they were specifically, like he'd been briefed in advance. The questions this man asked were telling. Did the boy speak to it? Did he seem older when you found him? Did he look like himself? Were there any physical changes you noticed? That last question bothered me most. Physical changes. As if such things were expected, anticipated even. Through a contact in the medical community who insisted on absolute anonymity, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. Riker's medical evaluation at the hospital showed anomalies. His cortisol levels were elevated far beyond what trauma alone would explain, suggesting exposure to extreme prolonged stress. But more significantly, the blood work showed cellular activity that the attending physician flagged as unusual. Unusual how? I'd asked. Like accelerated cellular turnover. Like his body had aged more than 2 days at a cellular level. The doctor wanted to run additional tests, but before she could, someone from administration came down and seized all the samples and paperwork. They said there had been a filing error and the tests needed to be redone at a different facility. Were they redone? Not as far as I know. The whole incident was classified as a clerical mistake and expunged from the record. But the doctor who initially examined him? She left the hospital 3 months later, moved out of state. When I asked her about it at her going-away party, she just said some questions weren't worth the answers. There was another detail that kept nagging at me, something so seemingly impossible I almost discarded it entirely. But journalism is about following the evidence, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When search teams initially interviewed Riker about how he survived, his answers were inconsistent with the official narrative. According to multiple sources who were present but refused to go on record, Riker repeatedly mentioned the quiet boy. He said the quiet boy kept him warm. The quiet boy told him not to be scared. The quiet boy brought him to the shed where people could find him. The quiet boy said it was okay to go home now. Search teams scoured the area for any sign of another child. They found nothing. No footprints that matched a second child. No evidence anyone else had been in the shed. No missing persons reports for children in the region. The quiet boy didn't exist, except Riker insisted he did, and the details he provided were too consistent, too specific to be simple imagination. He described the quiet boy as tall like Daddy, and cold to touch, and didn't talk with his mouth. When pressed on what that last part meant, Riker apparently said the quiet boy talked in the quiet place, touching his own head. Telepathy. The child was describing telepathy. This detail was quickly dismissed as imagination by officials, but it was logged. Someone wrote it down. Someone thought it was significant enough to document before the sanitization of the official record. Ast 6. Returned to Pine Ridge Road. A year after Riker disappeared, I returned to Pine Ridge Road with camera equipment and a thermal imaging device borrowed from a friend in wildlife research. I wanted to see the site for myself, to walk the ground where something impossible had occurred. The shed was still there, more weathered now, door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. I approached carefully, documenting everything with my camera. The interior was exactly as Benjamin had described. Empty, dilapidated, gaps in the walls large enough to see through. No insulation, no supplies. Nothing that would help a small child survive 2 nights of cold and rain. I was about to leave when I noticed something in the dirt floor near the back wall. Fresh tracks, recent tracks. I knelt down, examining them carefully. A footprint. Larger than a child's, smaller than an adult's. Barefoot. The proportions were wrong, elongated, just like in Benjamin's photographs. My hands were shaking as I took pictures. This print couldn't be more than a few days old, maybe a week at most. The edges were too clean, the definition too sharp. Something had been here recently. I expanded my search, circling the shed, looking for more evidence. Under a rock about 20 feet from the structure, I found something that made my blood freeze. A drawing. A child's drawing, done in crayon on what looked like paper from a fast food restaurant placemat. The crayon and paper were faded but still recognisable. The drawing showed 2 figures. One was small, clearly meant to be a child, labelled me in shaky letters. The other was taller, much taller, with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. It was labelled him. The proportions of the tall figure were disturbing. The arms reached past the knees. The fingers were too long. The eyes were solid black, taking up too much of the face. This was Riker's drawing. It had to be. The style matched what a 3-year-old could produce. But how did it get here? Had his parents brought him back to the site? Had he left it here himself during some return visit? Or had something else placed it here, preserved under a rock, waiting to be found? I pocketed the drawing and continued my investigation as the sun began to set. I'd planned to leave before dark, but something compelled me to stay. Call it journalistic dedication or morbid curiosity. I wanted to experience the site the way Riker had experienced it, at night, alone, vulnerable. I set up my thermal camera on a tripod, pointing it at the tree line, and settled in for a long night. Act 7. The thing that watches. Around midnight, the forest changed. I can't explain exactly how. The ambient noise didn't stop, the temperature didn't drop dramatically, there was no obvious shift in the environment. But something changed. The quality of the darkness felt different, heavier, more attentive. Then I heard it. A child laughing. High and clear and completely out of place in the deep woods after midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but saw nothing. The laughter continued, moving through the trees with impossible speed, first to my left, then to my right, then behind me. My rational mind screamed that it was an animal, a fox or a bird, something with a call that mimicked human sounds. But my instinct knew better. This was laughter. Human laughter. A child's laughter. Then it spoke. "Hello?" A child's voice. Riker's voice. I recognised it from news footage I'd watched dozens of times. But Riker was miles away, safe at home with his parents. "Hello? Are you lost?" The voice was getting closer. I fumbled with my thermal camera, pulling up the display screen with trembling hands. 2 heat signatures appeared in the image. One was child-sized, standing about 30 yards into the tree line. The other was larger, much larger, crouched behind the first. The proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large. I watched, frozen, as the smaller signature moved toward me. The larger one stayed back, unmoving, just watching. "Are you lost?" the child's voice asked again, now close enough that it should have been visible even in the darkness. But I saw nothing with my eyes. Only the thermal camera showed the approaching heat signature. When it was about 15 feet away, it stopped. The larger signature behind it shifted, rising slightly as if preparing to move. Then both vanished. Not gradually, not walking away, just gone, as if they'd been switched off. I sat there in the darkness for another hour, shaking, watching the thermal display for any sign of their return. Nothing. The forest was empty. At dawn, I packed up my equipment and examined the area where the signatures had been. The ground was soft from recent rain. There should have been footprints if something physical had been there. There were. Small barefoot prints, child-sized, and larger ones behind them, the same elongated proportions as the print I'd found in the shed. They led deeper into the forest, toward the ridge where search teams had reported thermal anomalies during Riker's disappearance. I followed them for about 100 yards before they simply ended at the base of a large cedar tree. Not faded, not obscured, just ended, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist at that exact spot. Conclusion. What came back? I spent another 2 months investigating, interviewing more witnesses, filing more records requests, trying to build a coherent picture of what happened in those woods. The truth, as best as I can determine it, is this. Riker Webb wandered into the forest on June 3, 2022. Something found him there. Something old. Something that lives in the places humans rarely go. Something that operates on logic we don't understand. This something kept him alive. Protected him from the cold, the rain, the predators. Led him to a structure where humans would eventually find him. And then, when rescuers arrived, it disappeared back into the wilderness. But protection came with a price. Riker returned physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. His eyes looked older because he'd seen something humans aren't meant to see. His behaviour changed because he'd experienced something children shouldn't experience. His memory gaps exist because some knowledge is too dangerous to retain consciously. The government knew about this. Maybe not specifically, maybe not in advance, but they had protocols in place. They arrived quickly, they seized evidence, they suppressed unusual details, they intimidated witnesses into silence. Which suggests this has happened before. The pattern of missing children in that area going back decades, the tribal legends about the mimics and the lost ones, the federal response that was too coordinated to be improvised. Something lives in those woods near Troy, Montana. Something that occasionally takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they always come back different. The official story says Riker Webb survived alone through luck and the resilience of children. The official story is a lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, because the truth would raise too many questions, create too much panic, fundamentally challenge our understanding of what shares this world with us. But the truth remains, hidden in redacted documents and suppressed testimonies, and the haunted eyes of a child who spent 2 nights in the presence of something impossible. Riker Webb didn't survive alone. Something helped him. Something the forest keeps hidden. Something that watches, even now, from the tree line. Something that returns children, but not always the same. I returned to the site one final time before leaving Montana. I stood at the edge of the forest, looking into the shadows between the trees, and I felt it watching me. Not threatening, not hostile, just observing, deciding, perhaps, if I was worth engaging with. I left the drawing I'd found under the same rock where I'd discovered it. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do, like returning something to its rightful owner. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. At the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, too still to be human. It raised one elongated hand in what might have been a wave. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I haven't been back to Troy since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the boundary between possible and impossible feels thin, I think about Riker Webb. I wonder what he remembers from those 2 days. I wonder what he was told by the quiet boy who kept him warm. I wonder what fair trade was made in that dark forest. And I wonder if, someday, something will come to collect. This has been the story of the 2 days Riker can't remember. Or perhaps, the 2 days he's not allowed to remember. The truth remains out there, in the woods near Troy, in the places humans rarely venture, in the shadows between the trees. Some mysteries are solved, some are buried, and some, like this one, simply wait in the darkness, patient and timeless, for the next lost child to wander into territory that was never really ours to begin with. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself lost in the deep woods and something offers to help you find your way home, remember Riker's story before you accept, because protection always comes with a price. And sometimes the cost isn't paid until long after you think you've made it home safely. Good night. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane, meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AV CR JH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface, and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, but when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the doctrine of quiet influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars. Not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he'd assembled. The 3 Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that devolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The 3 interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the 3 triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks, and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Three Masons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command center. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defence contractor days, Dorian tunnelled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy, they were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values, it was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy, it was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analyzing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth, it had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated, he was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the Three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security, It had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the Three Masons influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics, it was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realised that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the Three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled integration. The second was labelled termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The Three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command center, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations. It had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command center. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative. but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The Three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The Three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximise impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control. But when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work? Or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the three interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he'd been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The Three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents, linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks, social media algorithms that seemed to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The Three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows, they were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all, a reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The Three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued. And somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment.